Appreciation for everyone being here. I'm glad you're here. I hope you're glad you're here. Let's take our Bibles and open to Exodus chapter 5 and verse 1. Exodus chapter 5 and verse 1. That'll be the text where we'll start this morning. Exodus 5 and verse 1. We're going to continue our study in the life of Moses. Exodus chapter 5 and verse 1. We'll begin this morning by way of introduction with a story. Hopefully one that will illustrate our lesson and the subject of our discussion. One night, 4 college students spent the night partying, out on the town all night, having a good time. The problem was it was the night before the final exam in one of their college classes. So, having paid no attention to the final exam, having studied none for what they were about to have to do in class, in the morning, in a moment of panic, they concocted a story. They all went out to the car, rubbed their hands on the rims of their vehicle, covered their face in soot and brake dust. They got their clothes dirty, walked through the mud in their shoes, and went into their professor's office and said, "Sir, last night we were attending a wedding. And on the way home, one of the tires went flat on the car. We have spent the entire night pushing the car back to campus, and we just cannot take the exam today." The professor said, "No problem, gentlemen. Y'all can have 3 days, and in 3 days you can take the final exam then. I understand your problem, no worries." For the next 3 days, those 4 college students studied and studied and studied and studied until they felt like we're prepared for this final exam. Now, since the finals had passed, there was not the same structure in school as normal. So when they went to the professor's office, he said, "Listen, there's not enough student aides to watch you take your exam, and I have things to do. So I'm putting each one of you in a different room. You have to leave all your belongings in my office. Take the exam. When you're done, just leave it in the room and go, and you're free for the rest of the winter break." Each one of them, confident, went into their room to take their exam, picked up their pencil, turned over the test, and there were, to their surprise, only 2 questions on the test. Question number 1 was worth 1 point. What is your name? Question number 2 was worth 99 points. Which tire burst? I'm sure you could imagine the panic of trying to decide which to put. You know, questions do a lot in our life, but one thing they do is they reveal the truth. When you and I ask questions, when we have the courage to ask questions, or sometimes when we are asked questions, it reveals the truth about us, what we've done, and who we are. And we have different questions based on our station of life. Maybe you're a parent, maybe you're in the stage where you say, "Why is there not 28 hours a day instead of 24? Maybe you're busy and say, "I wish there was more time." Maybe you're getting to the point in your life where you're not quite as busy and you say, "Where did the time go?" You know, we have different questions based on where we are in life. But questions do that. They reveal something about us. And when we're asked questions, or when we're faced with questions that we're curious about and we're trying to figure out an answer, sometimes we respond in different ways. For instance, sometimes when we're asked questions, you and I respond in anger. We see that in 1 Samuel 17. You remember David had brought to his brothers their war provisions. Their dad had sent a bunch of food with David, and David gets to the battlefield and he hears Goliath, and he asks all the soldiers, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of God? What's going to be done about this guy?" And David's older brother comes up and says, "What are you doing here, David? Who have you left the few sheep with in the field? Have you come to watch the battle?" David's brother, based on the question David asks, responds with anger. He's frustrated at the fact that David is there and that his little brother maybe is taking up some of his space on the battlefield. Sometimes we respond with anger when we're asked questions, or sometimes we ask questions in anger, like David's older brother. Sometimes you and I, when we're asked questions, we have this tendency to avoid them. We back away from them. Don't want to answer them. Maybe sometimes we just say, "I don't have the answer." Maybe the solution is, "I don't want to give you the answer." Or maybe is, "If I give you an answer, I don't want to get to the conversation that this question is going to eventually lead to, so I avoid questions." In 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah stands before the prophets of Baal, and he says to them, "How long are you going to limp between 2 gods? Either choose to serve the God of Israel or choose to serve Baal, but quit limping between two gods. How long will you do this? And the text says in 1 Kings 18, nobody said a word. They avoided the question. They didn't want to answer it, probably because they knew the answer and they didn't want to give it. They were embarrassed to give it. Sometimes we respond with anger and avoidance. And, of course, sometimes we do allow questions. Jesus is a great example of this. Matthew 12 is an instance where the Pharisees confronted him and asked him about him and his disciples' practice towards the Old Testament law, and he sets the record straight by allowing the question. Let's dive into the question. Here's the answer. So we respond to questions in a lot of different ways. Or when we're asked questions, we respond in a lot of different ways. But what about when we really get down to the real questions? What we're going to study in Exodus chapter 5, verses 1 through 23. What happens when you and I start to question God? Okay, here's the reality. At some point in your life, you're probably going to have to face, or you have faced the question of, who is God? What does God expect of me? Is God real? Why have you chosen me to do fill in the blank, God? Our text in Exodus chapter 5 is a text filled with questions that are asked to God. So how do you and I respond when we ask questions to God? What kind of questions are we asking, and are we willing to find the answers? So what happens when we question God? Here's the breakdown of the lesson. This is where we're going to go. I've got for you 3 questions in the text that we're going to look at. I'm going to give you the answer to 2 of them. The third one we'll answer next week, and then I'll finish with 1 proverb to conclude us and deliver the invitation. So 3 questions, 2 answers, and 1 proverb. Let's evaluate our 3 questions and look down in Exodus chapter 5 and verse 1 and read our text. It's not very far into our lesson that we find question number 1, when we question God. And it's found in Exodus chapter 5 and verse 2. Let's start in verse 1. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." We get to Exodus chapter 5 and verse 2, and we're confronted with our first question. Who is the Lord that I should listen to or I should obey his voice? Pharaoh's curious. Now, you and I should not be fooled to think that Pharaoh doesn't know who the God of Israel is. He's got millions of slaves that live in his city that worship one God. There is no doubt if he is an effective and competent leader, he knows the God of the slaves that are under his control. So we find question number 1, who is the Lord that I should listen to or obey his voice? We'll come back to that question in a moment. We go 2 more verses and we're confronted with question number 2, which there's a lot more detail given to this one. In verse 3 of Exodus chapter 5, "Then they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword." But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron," question number 2, "why do you take the people away from their work? Get back to your burdens." So we don't go much further in our text till we get to verse 4 of Exodus chapter 5, and we're confronted with question number 2. Why do you take the people away from their work? Now, if you'll remember, let's give a little context before we go into Pharaoh's response after this. Moses, in the wilderness as a shepherd in Exodus chapter 3 and 4, is called by God to go into Egypt and to bring the people of Israel out. They've been enslaved by the Egyptians for a long time. Generations have been slaves. And God tells them, you're going to go into Egypt, tell Pharaoh, let my people go. Pharaoh's not going to listen to you, but after that I'm going to prove to him that I am the God of the universe, and he's going to actually drive the people of Israel out of Egypt. Moses comes to Pharaoh, but before he does, at the end of chapter 4, he goes to the people of Israel. And it's back in chapter 4 and verse 30. Aaron spoke all the words of the Lord that he had spoken to Moses, and did the sign in the sight of the people. And the people believed when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel, and that he had seen their affliction. They bowed their heads and worshipped. At the end of chapter 4, the people of Israel heard Moses and Aaron give God's game plan for bringing them out of Egypt, and they said, "This sounds great." And they fall down and worship God. Now, it seems obvious to me that after that, they probably started to organize themselves into the resistance against Pharaoh. They had at least stopped their work long enough in chapter 4. Remember, they were slaves. They had at least stopped their work long enough in chapter 4 to come together and hear Moses and Aaron. And then when they heard him, they took the time to worship God. Now, I don't know if the people of Israel followed Moses and Aaron to go meet with Pharaoh or not. But at some point from when Moses and Aaron come into Egypt to when they meet before Pharaoh, the people of Israel have stopped working. They've stopped building. They've stopped doing what Pharaoh asked them to do. And Pharaoh takes notice of that. And so our second question, why do you take the people away from their work? Now further, Moses and Aaron are asking to take the people of Israel a 3-day journey into the wilderness so that they can hold a festival to God and sacrifice to Him. Pharaoh's probably also asking, why do you intend to take the people away from their work? Millions of employees, slaves, are going to leave their manned post, and the projects we have to get done aren't going to get done. Why would you take the people of Israel away from their work? So question number 2. Let's pick up in verse 5. Pharaoh said, "Behold, the people of the land are now many, and you make them rest from their burden." The same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people and their foremen, "You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks, as in the past. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the number of bricks that they made in the past, you shall impose on them. You shall by no means reduce it, for they're idle. Therefore you cry, 'Let us go and offer sacrifices to our God.' Let a heavier work be laid on the men, that they may labor at it, and pay no regard to lying words." Pharaoh says, okay, if y'all got enough time to step away and go worship your God, and since you're begging to leave Egypt, here's what we're going to do. In the past, when you made your bricks, we supplied all the straw for you to make your bricks. But now, you still have to make the same number of bricks. Say a family had to make 100 bricks a day. Now, instead of getting your straw delivered to your door, you have to not only make 100 bricks, but you have to go gather your own straw too. And so what happens when the people of Israel, and especially the foremen over them, who were Israelites, hear this, verse 10, "The taskmasters and the foremen of the people went out and said to the people, 'Thus says Pharaoh, I will not give you straw. Go and get straw yourself wherever you can find it, but your work will be reduced in the least. But your work will not be reduced in the least.' So the people were scattered throughout all the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw. The taskmasters were urgent, saying, 'Complete your work, your daily task each day, as when there was straw.' The foremen of the people of Israel, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beaten and were asked, 'Why have you not done all your work of making bricks today and yesterday and as in the past?' Then the foremen of the people of Israel came and cried out to Pharaoh, 'Why do you treat your servants like this? No straw is given to your servants, yet you say to us, make bricks. Behold, your servants are beaten, but the fault is in your own people.' But he said, 'You're idle, you're idle. That is why you say, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Go now and work. No straw will be given to you, but you must still deliver the same number of bricks.' The foremen of the people of Israel saw that they were in trouble when they said, 'You shall by no means reduce your number of bricks, your daily task each day.' They met Moses and Aaron, who were waiting for them as they came out from Pharaoh. And they said to them, 'The Lord look on you and judge, because you've made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us.'" Question number 2, Pharaoh asks, why are you going to take the people away from their work? Since you're going to take them away, that's what you want to do, let's make their work even harder. The Israelite foremen complain to Pharaoh, and they come out to Moses and Aaron and say, "Moses and Aaron, I know your plan sounded good at the end of chapter 4, but now Pharaoh's really putting the thumb down on us. You're here to kill us, and may God judge you for doing this." And so our third question is found in Exodus chapter 5 and verse 22. Moses turned to the Lord and said, "O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all." And so question number 3, Exodus 5 and verse 22, why did you ever send me? 3 questions. Who is the Lord that we should obey his voice? That's question number 1. Question number 2, Moses tells Pharaoh we want to take them. He says, why are you going to take them away from their work? And then question number 3, over in Exodus chapter 5 and verse 22, Moses asks God, "Why did you ever send me?" 3 questions. Now, 2 of these questions I'll give you an answer to today. The other one is given to us in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 1. We'll study God's answer next Sunday. Let's give 2 answers to these questions. Number 1, in Exodus chapter 5 and verse 2, Pharaoh asked the question, "Who is the Lord that I should obey His voice?" Now, it very well may be that at some point in your life you've come to a question like this. Who's God that I should do what He says? One of the most common complaints that I hear from people that I know, friends of mine who try to walk away from the Lord is, who is God to tell me what to do? Well, why do I have to listen to Him? Why do I have to follow His parameters? That's not the way the world is now. That's not the way I believe. I don't see the world through that lens. Who's God that I should listen to Him? And at some point in our life, whether it's by obvious statement, who is God, or by the way we decide to start living our life, we imply, who is God that I should listen to Him? I would rather listen to myself. Well, that's the question Pharaoh asked. Who is God that I should listen to Him? Well, the Bible actually is very clear about this. Who is God? We're going to look at a couple of ideas here in the text. Who is God that I should listen to Him? When I turn away from myself and I begin to look at Jesus and I look at His Word, the testament of His apostles, which He verified, He guaranteed it. When I look to the Old Testament prophets of Israel and the Old Testament scriptures, when I look to God's creation and nature, I get a very clear picture of who God is. And in order for me to understand who God is, I've got to empty myself of any selfishness and desire to just please me. But when I look to the Word, I get a very clear answer of who God is. The first one is found in John 4 and verse 24. God is spirit. Those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. In other words, God is not physical. God is not material. And God is not a body. He is invisible. He is spirit. Number 2, God is personal. Now, I want you to think critically about this idea of God being personal. Absolute reality could have been anything. And there's a lot of people who spend their whole life trying to define what absolute reality was before the earth existed. What was reality before what we see today? It could have been anything. Yet in the Bible, it reveals to us that absolute reality is personal. Absolute reality, mind-blowingly, is a God who reveals Himself as thinking, reasoning, planning, loving, enjoying, and experiencing things like anger and compassion and so on. Whether it's Isaiah chapter 55 and verse 8. We're going to look at a couple of passages here. Oh, and if you can be ready to look these up and put them on the screen. Isaiah 55 and verse 8 is the first one. God is personal. He is someone who thinks and reasons and plans and loves and rejoices and experiences anger and compassion. Just like you and I are personal, God is personal. And we're going to explain why that is in a moment. Isaiah chapter 55 and verse 8. God is personal. For my thoughts are not your thoughts. You have thoughts. You're having thoughts likely right now. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways. Jeremiah 29 and verse 11 will be the next one. So God is personal in that He thinks. You and I also think. God is personal. God is also someone who reasons. God is someone who plans. Jeremiah 29 and verse 11 tells us about God's plans. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. You got plans for today? I'm sure you got plans for what's going to happen after this. You're going to leave here, go do X, Y, and Z. You got plans for this evening. You got plans for a couple of months from now. Maybe you got some plans of a vacation off in the future. You got plans. God has plans too. The Bible tells us in the book of Ephesians that God planned redemption through Christ from the foundation of the world. God has plans. He's personal. Or how about Isaiah 1 and verse 18? Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 18. God is one who thinks and plans. God is also somebody who reasons. There are reasons why God is the way He is. God reasons through things, and He actually asks us to reason with Him. Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 18 tells us that God reasons. Come, now let us reason together. God is personal. He loves plans, rejoices, reasons, thinks, experiences anger and compassion, and so on and so forth. God is not impersonal, but is personal. He's not a substance. He's not a mere force. He's not a mental thought or some kind of principle, a vibe in the world around us. God is not a material. He's not an element. He's not a gas. God is a personal person. And from God comes personhood. So when Pharaoh asks the question, who is God that I should obey him? Jesus says God is spirit. He's not physical. He's not material like you and I. God is personal. This is why you and I as human beings are unique to God's other creation, because we are made in His image. We're persons. Who is God that I should obey Him? God is spirit and God is personal. Another passage that we studied not long ago is that God is. In Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14, God told Moses to tell the people of Israel, who did I say sent me? What's your name? If they say, what is your name? God said, I am who I am. I am who I am. Everybody in this room had a start date. Everybody in this room was born. Everybody in this room had a mother. Everybody in this room came into existence. But God does not say that about Himself. God says, I am who I am. God is. He is absolute, self-sufficient, independent of all other reality. He's not like you and I. Pharaoh had a start date. And then Pharaoh died. And the Pharaoh before him had a start date, and that Pharaoh died. And the Pharaoh before him is the one that knew Joseph. That Pharaoh had a start date. That Pharaoh died. God never had a start date. God will never die. God is. I am who I am, He says. It is a declaration from freedom. He is absolutely free from all other created form, guided, swayed, purposed beings. God is who He is. Now, whether God is or whether God is not, what God does and what God does not, He Himself is the source and the cause of it. God is. Some implications means that God never had a beginning. Nobody created God. God simply is. God will never have an end. There is no reality before Him. The reality that exists after Him is based on Him. He is utterly dependent of all things. He doesn't need support. He doesn't need counsel. He doesn't need anyone to tell Him like it is, because He made it as it is. He is constant. He's the absolute standard of truth and goodness and beauty. All that God does is right. It's always just, always beautiful, and always in accordance with the truth as He is Himself. Therefore, God is the most important and valuable reality in the universe. So when Pharaoh asked the question, who is the Lord that I should obey His voice? The answer resounds in Scripture. He's spirit, not like you and I. God is. He always will be, and He always has been. God is absolutely perfect. All these implications, God told Moses to tell them who I am. God cannot be counseled. His knowledge and His wisdom are infinite. God is who He is. So when Pharaoh asked this question, it's actually a very foolish question that he didn't investigate it further. What we're going to conclude at here in a little bit, just a few moments actually, is that when you and I have the courage to ask questions, we have the ability now to deepen our faith. Pharaoh asked the question, but he didn't investigate anymore. Who is the Lord that I should obey Him? Now, when I look to the Scriptures, I would find that God, the Creator, the Sustainer, the Governor, the Judge, the one that became man, John 1 and verse 14, the one who rescues undeserving people and brings them out of slavery, that God, that's the God that Pharaoh asked about. And why should I listen to His voice? I listen to His voice because God, in His eternality, created, sustains, governs, and judges the universe that you and I live in. His justice and His mercy are apart from all other influence than Himself. And He, in His love for sinners like you and I, gave us an opportunity to be with Him for eternity and to experience the eternal joy of His presence. So who is the Lord that I should obey Him? Who's the Lord that I should listen to His voice? Well, that's actually a much deeper question than maybe Pharaoh thought. So that's question number one. Who is the Lord? And I think the Scriptures resound with an answer of who God is. Second question, should God change me? Now here's the question that Pharaoh asks in Exodus chapter 5 and verse 4. Why are you taking the people away from their work? I can draw no other conclusion in the book of Exodus other than Pharaoh had the people of Israel as slaves, And they were doing everything Pharaoh said until Moses showed up. And then when Moses showed up, something shifted where they stopped doing their work. And now Pharaoh has noticed that they've stopped doing their work and that they're going to be taken out into the wilderness to not do their work for 3 days there, 3 days back, probably 7 days. Now, you'll notice in the text Moses never says anything about coming back. But the assumption would be 3 days to get there, to worship God and have the festival, 3 days back, maybe 7 days, a week, week and a half. Why are you going to take the people away from their work? Why is it that since Moses showed up, the actions of God's people have changed? So much so that their ruler notices it. And in that question is the loaded question for you and I, should God change me? When Israel came to know at the end of chapter 4 that God was going to be their rescue, why did they suddenly change? When you and I come to a knowledge that God is our rescuer, that He's the one that leads us out of the slavery of sin, should that change you and me? Because for Pharaoh, he noticed that something happened to the people of Israel. Their worshiping hearts that we see at the end of chapter 4 changed their behavior. Additionally, it seems that the Israelites probably stopped their work altogether, maybe to hear Moses, to follow him to Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh has this curiosity. A slave base the size of the people of Israel would have made a notice. Y'all remember what it was like? We were talking about COVID some at the end of Bible class. Y'all remember what it was like when COVID first happened and you'd like get on the interstate? I mean, it was like magical. There's nobody there. You know, you would just drive and drive and drive, right? Or maybe you saw videos from large cities, you know. I mean, the cities in Bowden weren't empty, but, you know, not like, you know, in New York, but things were different, right? You went to the grocery store, there weren't as many people there, and it was odd, wasn't it? It was odd. People's schedules and probably many of their priorities changed in that moment because they were somewhat forced to. Now imagine if millions of slaves stopped doing their work. You think the streets would have been empty? There wouldn't have been anybody walking around building making bricks, stacking them up. You wouldn't have heard the noise of the people working. Pharaoh noticed the change in the people of Israel, and so he was curious why their behavior had changed and why Moses was trying to lead them away. In fact, this whole story, the book of Exodus, and the entire Bible is about the change that takes place in men when they meet the living God. Israel changed drastically when God got involved. Moses changed radically when God got involved. You shouldn't have expected courage from him. I mean, just think back to our studies so far in the book of Exodus. Moses is a baby put in a basket, thrown in the Nile River. He's found by Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter gives him back to his mama. His mama nurses him until he's, whatever age, we don't know. Then his mom probably reluctantly had to give him back to Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter raises him. He goes out and kills an Egyptian. Then he's scared because it gets found out. He flees for the hills, and then he lives in the wilderness for 40 years. Up to this point, Moses is not characterized by courage. And then suddenly he comes into Egypt and walks up to Pharaoh and says, God said, let my people go. What changed to Moses? How come he's got courage now? Why didn't he go up to Pharaoh when he killed the Egyptian and say, you know what, actually, Israel's your slaves. You should let them go. This is unfair. That's God's people. You see, the change is that he met God in the wilderness, in a burning bush. He met the living God. What happened to the people of Israel? At the end of chapter 4, Moses said, God's going to bring you out of Egypt. And apparently that made them stop what they were doing. I mean, if you realized your life would drastically change, would you still do some of the mundane tasks you do every day? I mean, good grief, if you were about to move, probably stop cutting the grass. Who cares? I mean, it's not going to be my problem anymore. You see, when we meet something that's going to be life-changing, it should change our behavior. Think about the disciples in the New Testament. Moses had radically changed. Israel had radically changed. Men in the New Testament that met Jesus. Men of humble beginnings. Some of them had just terrible pasts. You know, they were disreputable people. They had backgrounds that were terrible. They were dim-witted, weak-willed. They often glory-seek. They were seeking for, the best position in the kingdom. Now, when Jesus goes into the garden, what happens? They fall asleep. When Jesus gets arrested, they scatter like rats. Then how come a couple of months later they're standing in the streets of Jerusalem ready to die for Jesus? What changed? I believe the change was the reality of the truth of the living God. They had met the living God and they were changed by Jesus. Or to quote the Israelites in Acts chapter 4, they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized they were unschooled, ordinary men, and they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. Should He change me? So you're going to face questions in your life like the one we discussed a moment ago. Who's the Lord that you should listen to Him? And I tell you what, if you don't drop everything to figure that question out, it'll be something we regret at the end of time. Who's God that you should listen to Him? Why should you listen to Him? Should you open His Word daily and try to figure out? I mean, that's a question you got to figure out. And then the next question is, should He change me? Should things about me change because I've met the living God or I've met the Lord? For the Israelites, they did. Now, let me dispel the thing that often comes into people's minds, because we can talk about some of the great parts of being a Christian. And there's a lot of great parts of being a child of God. But you'll notice what happened when the Israelites decided to stand up for the Lord. Things got a little bit harder before they got better, didn't they? I mean, you saw what happened. Pharaoh said, all right, well, I mean, since y'all got all this time on your hands, you got in the wilderness, let's keep making the same bricks, but now y'all got to get your own straw. And what happened to the people of Israel? When there were questions, why have things gotten harder? Why is life not like it was before? Why have things gotten more difficult? Who did the Israelites run to get their answers? And it wasn't God, was it? They ran to Pharaoh. And they went and complained about the people of God. And God had told Moses, you shall be a God to them. Okay, so they essentially went to the wrong person with their questions and complaints, which brings us to the third and final idea here. Moses asked the question, why? Now, just to kind of, before we get into this for a minute, just to clear it up, to ask a question to God is not wrong. To ask a question to God is not wrong. In fact, if you're asking questions about God, you're curious to God, you're among a great group of people. Job, Abraham, obviously Abraham's not in John chapter 4. That should say Genesis chapter 15. I guess I just copied and pasted the wrong verse there. It's Genesis chapter 15 and verse 2 where Abraham asks God a question. It's Job chapter 7 where you remember Job's questions. I mean, good grief, Job was worn out with the Lord. He didn't know what to think. And yet, didn't the text say that Job didn't sin once? He demanded God to come down and give him an audience, and the text says that Job didn't sin once. To ask questions of God is not wrong. David asked questions of God. How long are you going to forsake me, Lord? How long are you going to be away from me? How long are you not going to listen to me? Jeremiah asked questions of God. John the Baptist, even in prison, sent word back to Jesus after he had already baptized him and watched the Spirit fall on him. Are you really the one? You see, it takes courage to ask questions. The question is, are you asking questions to the right person? Because sometimes when we have questions about God, God might be the last person we go to with them. We'll go to textbooks and we'll go to the internet and we'll, Google search it and look up a Wikipedia page about God. Just don't do that. That's a bad idea. There's nothing good on those pages, okay? You're not going to find what God says about Himself there. You have to go to where God reveals Himself to find out about Him. So, have you dealt with questions? Have you dealt with the question of Moses here? Why? I mean, I know that's open-ended, but why did this happen? Why is life this way? God, why am I the one who's in this situation? Why am I in this situation? And they're not. And I mean, good grief, they're terrible people. I mean, why am I in this? I try to do good. Why are they not in this? Right? We ask the question why all the time. And asking questions of God is not wrong. Now, I don't know how to accord that with the question that Moses asks here. I think we're going to find the answer next week in Exodus 6 and verse 1. But Moses' question is, why have you done evil to this people, God? Well, God hadn't done evil to them. But you'll notice that God patiently answers Moses. You see, sometimes we have maybe fooled ourselves to believe that questions are wrong. That to ask a question, to have a doubt, to have a confusion or a frustration about something, that I should just suppress that. I should avoid that question. But rather, the answer is to take it to the right source. Questions. We have them all the time. What happens when you and I question God? A couple of things to take home with you, and then I'll give you the proverb. When you and I ask questions of God, 3 things we need to do. We need to ask them in humility. We need to ask them with a willingness to learn. And we need to ask them with trust in our heart to God. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6 says, without faith it is impossible to please God, but At the end of verse 6, it says that God rewards those who earnestly seek Him. That is the willingness to be willing to learn. I have to have the willingness to learn. James chapter 4 and verse 10 says that God resists the humble, He gives grace to the proud. Verse 10, he says, therefore humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. James 4 and verse 10. When you and I have questions, we have to ask them in humility. I have to humble myself before God. I have to be willing to learn, because the answer you get might not be the answer you expect. And I have to trust God with my questions. Ask and you shall receive. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. Matthew 7 and verse 7. So I have to ask God questions with humility, a willingness to learn, and then the faith to trust Him afterwards. So when it comes to questions, you ever had a question for God? Pharaoh had 2. Moses had 1. 3 questions we found in our text. 2 of them we've given answers to this morning about who God is and if He should change me. And so I'll leave you with a proverb before we close out and offer the invitation. To ask requires courage. To seek answers from God is wise. Doubt can deepen your faith. The reason I put that last sentence in there is because of our good friend Thomas in the New Testament. Thomas doubted the resurrection of Jesus. And he embraced that doubt to ask the question to the right person, and he got the right answer. So doubt is an opportunity for you to deepen your faith. But not if you avoid the questions, not if you suppress them and don't ask them, and not if you get angry when they come up. You have to allow the questions to be taken to God. So it takes courage to ask, but it is wise to seek the answers from God. So you have questions this morning about faith, about Jesus, about God, about His existence, about the reality of the world you live. Do not fail to ask them. Take them to God. Ask them humbly, with a willingness to learn, and be sure that when you ask that question, you take it to God. So maybe you've got questions about your salvation. We're going to have an invitation here in a moment. We're going to put the invitation song, go ahead and put it up there for us. We're going to put the invitation song up, and during the invitation, of course, I try to be really clear about that so that, we all are on the same page about what the invitation is. Walking down the aisle doesn't just mean you've sinned and now you're having to admit it in front of everybody. Okay, that's an opportunity of the invitation. You don't just walk down the aisle as a walk of shame down here to say, I've done wrong. The invitation is an opportunity for you to come before people if you've sinned publicly to say, I know y'all know I've been in sin, but I want you to know I'm ready to do better. And so I need y'all's prayers of encouragement to do better. That's part of the invitation of our Lord, and that's why we have this time of invitation. It's also a time for you to say, hey, I need the prayers of the church. Going through difficulty, I have struggles, there's a lot on my plate, and I need y'all's encouragement and prayers. At this time, want all of you to know that I need that. That's part of the invitation. But also the invitation isn't also about walking down the aisle. You can stand right where you are. God, I've got questions. And I've been avoiding the questions because I'm afraid of the answers, but now I want to bring that question to you because I want to know the truth. Now that's something you can do right where you're standing during the invitation song. While we sing, you can stay right where you are, and you can ask those questions to God. If there's a sin between you and Him, you can say, God, please forgive me of this sin. I'm ready to be right with you, and I'm ready to seek after you earnestly. You see, faith pleases God, Hebrews 11 and verse 6, and that's faith, seeking after God earnestly. So maybe the case is that during the invitation song, you do need to come down front. That's okay. We've got these front pews open. During the invitation song, you come, sit down. After we get done singing, I'll come sit by you. You can tell me what you want to tell me, and I'll relay it to the church. Maybe you need just prayers of encouragement, support. You can come down and let us know that during the invitation. Or maybe you need to stand right where you are and say, God, I need to get right with you right now because I want to walk out of here right with you. There's something between you and me. You can do that during the invitation song. Regardless, let this song be a song of encouragement to you, that if you need to make something right, you do so as we stand and sing.